So we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. My name's Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the executive director here at the Harvard Law School Library. Welcome to the Law Library's Book Talks. Please continue to eat your lunch while we go through. I want to thank the Dean's Office for their generous support of our book talks and to allow us to bring our amazing faculty here to share their work. I do want to let you know that books are for sale outside the door if you didn't see that. Professor Sunstein will be around after the talk to sign your book if you'd like that. And I also want to let you know that today's talk is being recorded, including the question and answer period. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Cass Sunstein, who's the Robert Walmsley University professor here at Harvard. He's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. He's testified before congressional committees on many subjects and has been involved in constitution making and law reform activities in a number of nations. He was an administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and has served on President Obama's review group on the intelligence and communications and on the Defense Innovation Board of the Department of Defense, which may or may not help his expertise in Star Wars. He's a prolific writer. He's the author of innumerable articles and books such as Conspiracy Theories and Other Dangerous Ideas, Why Nudge? Simpler, The Future of Government and Laws, Beyond Fear, Beyond the Precautionary Principle. And I highlight these titles specifically because many of the ideas Professor Sunstein explores in those books can be found in the Star Wars films. So without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Sunstein to discuss his book, The World According to Star Wars.
Okay, so shall I tell you the secret origins of this new book, which is a fundamental revision of a relatively new book? Does that suggest I have too much time on my hands? And here are the recent conversation that produced it, and then I'll tell you the deeper source, which is not so recent. So after the original book came out, I think in 2017, there was one person I was terrified of meeting, and it was George Lucas. So if I'd met someone who had a gun, that would have been scary, but George Lucas scarier. And I found myself at a very large event, probably hundreds of people, and there in the distance was George Lucas. And I found myself getting smaller and smaller. And, almost like a Star Wars scene, I was merging with the floor, and that was a good thing. But I was looking up from the floor, and there, seeming immense, like 12 feet tall, was George Lucas walking toward me. Hundreds of people, and he's walking toward me, who's small, so small I can't even be seen, and yet he sees. So he comes up to me and says very quietly, the worst words you could imagine. I read your book. And he didn't seem at all happy. What you need to know about George Lucas is, well, he's a great person. He's not an LA person. He's not a glad-hander or a on your back, hooray for you. And then he paused and he said, also without a lot of joy, it's not bad. And then he paused and he said, it's pretty good. And then he got really happy. And he looked at me and he said, but you made mistakes. And then we talked about mistakes, and that was relevant to the revision of the book. Nothing I say is, should he be held responsible for, of course, because he's the man. But I learned some things in the conversation. The distant origins came actually from maybe 20 years ago, where there was a project here at Harvard, an interdisciplinary project, asking the question, why does the United States not have social and economic guarantees? Now, this might seem far afield, but they're candidate answers for this intriguing question. Why don't we have a right to subsistence, or a right to welfare of some kind, or a right to medical care as a constitutional matter, or a right to environmental protection? Why don't we have any of those? And the candidate answers, which had to do with something deep about American culture, or about the original history of the Constitution, or about the Civil War, on investigation, they all fall apart. They're all really weak. They're powerful in the sense that once you hear them, a light bulb of recognition goes off, but they're no good. The best account of why the United States doesn't have social and welfare guarantees, I think, has a lot to do with serendipity, that something happened in certain periods of time that are a little like butterflies clapping their wings, by which the arc of American constitutional understandings turns all round. So the idea here is that social change and whatever is often much less a product of deep cultural forces or of something hardwired into a tradition than of something serendipitous that turns out to snap or to shut up at exactly the right time. And that got me fascinated by the success of Star Wars, which is going to be my main question here. So you recognize that? And does it produce a feeling of a certain kind? There we go. When I did a publicity tour for the outmoded version of this book, the pre-George Lucas version of this book, and I have to say that of all professional experiences I've had improbably, that turned out to be a candidate for the most meaningful. And the reason was the number of people who would come up to me and say, I saw this with my dad when I was 8 years old, and start crying, was high. The number of people who said, I saw this with my child when she was 12, is also large. And the most striking but representative example is someone from a very conservative group in Washington who was heading a kind of think tank that is very much to the right, kind of suspicious of my presence there, though he was part of a group that invited me. I asked him, like Star Wars, and he said, very much. And I said, how come? And he said, let me tell you a story. This was a man of indeterminate age. He could have been late 30s or he could have been late 60s. He had one of those faces you just couldn't tell. He could have been an extremely young 60 or a kind of struggling 38. And he talked about his son having a brain tumor and going to the hospital after the period of recovery. And he said, the first thing I did was to take my son, my young son, about 9 years old, to a Star Wars movie. And I said with trepidation, is your son okay? And he said, oh yeah, he's 28 and he's working in New York. And the extent of his emotional engagement with what Star Wars did and how it connected him and his son, after that conversation, I would have given him the suit, the jacket I was wearing, like that, if he needed it. And that says something about the human connection that Star Wars, I observed, breeds across people who are different along multiple dimensions. I think Lucas got at something about both human psychology and about the experience of art in a Clash of the Titans, which was recorded in real time, which was when Lawrence Kasdan, also one of the great screenwriters, was arguing vigorously with Lucas about what to do in Return of the Jedi, that is, in release order, the third one released. Kasdan says, I think you should kill Luke and have Leia take over. Lucas says, you don't want to kill Luke. Kasdan, okay, then kill Yoda. Lucas, I don't want to kill Yoda. You don't go around killing people. It's not nice. And then Kasdan tries to say something about his understanding of art. He says, I'm trying to give the story some kind of an edge. I'm saying that the movie has more emotional weight if someone you love is lost along the way. The journey has more impact. And then Lucas's, I think, perfect response, I don't like that, and I don't believe that. Notice that not liking is preceding not believing, that his disbelief is affected by his emotional disapproval of this. And I'll confess, when I was talking to George Lucas about Star Wars, he mentioned in The Force Awakens that Han dies, and he says, Kasdan was always trying to kill people. Okay, before we get to the substance, we're going to have an authoritative ranking of Star Wars movies, because people are often curious about what the authoritative ranking is, and here are facts. Solo is at the bottom. It gets a low pass. The Phantom Menace is amazing in its way, but that's all we can say about it. C+. Attack of the Clones is pretty good. The Last Jedi loses the golden thread of George Lucas. It is brilliant in its way, but the themes that Lucas made carved on the psyche of generations of moviegoers were lost, and I'll explain that a little bit, notwithstanding the brilliance of the movie. The Force Awakens is a terrific reboot, repetitive to be sure, but props to the word terrific. The Rise of Skywalker sticks the ending. Don't argue. J.J. Abrams, unlike Rian Johnson, J.J. Abrams is all over what Lucas is about, what Star Wars is about. That enables him to stick the ending, and you'll see some of the connections in a moment. In terms of the best, Revenge of the Sith has complete genius in it, but it's uneven. Rogue One is perfect in every way, but it's Rogue One, so it can't be at the top. Return of the Jedi is touched by genius unquestionably as well. A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back are transcendent. They are the two best movies ever made. Return of the Jedi and Rogue One are the third and fourth best movies ever made. Okay, here's the question. Why did Star Wars succeed? The answer to this question, I'm going to explore the possibility, will tell us something about why originalism has succeeded as an approach to constitutional law, when in not that distant memory it was off the table or thought by some, but kind of crazy. Why did behavioral economics work as it has? Why is the Green New Deal resonating? Why is President Trump president? Why is Senator Sanders the strong, apparent, current front runner? Why have organic foods and #MeToo turned out to be much more successful than many people thought possible? And the larger question is, why is all this essentially unpredictable? So the claim is going to be about the absence of laws of success or failure, which also gives some clues about how to make it happen, but also about how foresight is often not possible. Okay, Star Wars has earned more than $30 billion as of a recent-ish authoritative accounting, which means that its earnings are right around the middle of the 193 nations in the United Nations. It might be getting its own seat, depending on how the arc of the universe travels, though right now it doesn't have a seat at the UN. It does have earnings exceeding the gross domestic product of about 90 of the world's nations. Okay, what's baffling about this is that no one expected that it would be a hit. At the studio that released it, there was apathy, and many executives had little faith in the film or in Lucas. They hoped a lot of times that it would just go away. Lucas himself thought that this would be maybe like a Disney movie, it would do okay, but he was sufficiently nervous that he went to Hawaii at the time, thinking this might be a disaster after all these years, and I don't want to see a disaster for which I was perhaps responsible. At the time, there was not enough celluloid printed by the studio to meet the early demand. The studio expected advance guarantees of $10 million. That's not a lot, and it got a small fraction of that, $1.5 million. There's a tale of the rough cut being shown to a bunch of terrific experts and directors, etc., not the studios. The studio saw it and said, oh my God, terrible, failure. How did we do this? Lucas also showed it to a bunch of people who thought, oh man, this isn't good, who were his friends. One person stood up and said, George Lucas, you have made the best movie I've ever seen. And that was Steven Spielberg. He was the one who saw it. Okay, how did this happen? I'm going to investigate a bunch of hypotheses. And the first is the one that I believe in most. I believe it's correct, but it's not the whole picture. How many of you have seen a movie that won the Oscar a few years ago called Searching for Sugar Man? Okay, so about a sixth. It's a very gripping movie, and what to make of it is not made clear by the movie maker. It tells a story, and it's a true story. It's about a 60s, 70s pop musician named Rodriguez, whom no one had heard of, who disappeared. He made 2 albums, and they kind of fell off. They didn't do very well. And then he became a construction worker. And he lived his life with his family as a pretty happy construction worker. But in South Africa, Rodriguez was Bob Dylan. He was the Beatles. He was Taylor Swift. He was a giant. People would talk about Rodriguez with awe and reverence, thinking, why did he disappear? Some said he died. The others said he lit himself on fire and burned up on stage. Others said he was just too good for us, and he stopped providing what he had to give us. He was too large, too amazing. I don't know if American culture has a figure like this. Someone, maybe James Dean is the closest. I think probably James Dean is the closest. Someone who was like a comet who fell off, but still resonates, and they're posters of the person. Okay, the tale of the movie, the question the movie raises is why in South Africa was Rodriguez the biggest, and everywhere else was he basically a flop? He himself didn't know until the movie makers told him that he was a giant in South Africa. Okay, one hypothesis is that he resonated with the South African culture distinctly. You'd have to do a lot of work to make that one plausible. You could. The argument that he resonated with South Africa is what the great deceased law professor named Charles Black called one step ahead of the sheriff arguments, which are arguments which you're making running hard against someone who's pursuing you, who knows your argument makes no sense, but you're really trying. We've all made one step ahead of the sheriff arguments, even in classes, yes? I think the idea that Rodriguez resonated particularly with the South African culture is a desperate argument. It's a one step ahead of the sheriff argument, though it's where the human mind goes. Okay, there's a writer named Robert Gottlieb. How many people have heard of Robert Gottlieb? Very few. He has written some excellent mysteries that are detective stories that have done not very well until it was disclosed that this is the pen name for the same person who wrote the Harry Potter stories, at which point the mysteries became terrific bestsellers. There was a world in which these novels were unknown and failures. There is a world, our world, in which they are known and basically terrifically successful. History has been run twice, and in one world the name is known, in the other the name is unknown. William Blake, who will come up later, is one of the greatest and most admired and revered poets in the English language. In his time, he was a failure. He was regarded as nothing. And he had to be revived by subsequent admirers to become canonical. Jane Austen, whose last name might not be spelled right here as a way of making sure you're paying attention. Jane Austen, in her time, was one of a set of women authors who were regarded as basically equal. All of them were very good. It's not clear Austen was believed to be the best. She has vaulted into, the pantheon of the great novelists the English language has. And the suggestion I'm making is that the Gottlieb tale is the Rodriguez one in a very simple, recent way. The success of Blake and Jane Austen is the same as the Rodriguez tale, where we happen to live in a world where Blake and Austen are like Rodriguez in South Africa, but many readers and writers of English lived in a world in which they were like Rodriguez in the United Kingdom or Germany or the United States, meaning who's that? And this is a claim about the serendipity of success and failure. It doesn't mean that lousiness can turn out to be great triumph. You have to go over a threshold, and maybe it has to be very high. Nonetheless, among the things that go over those thresholds, there are multiple equilibria, which we won't see because history is run only once, which is another way of saying the arc of human history is noisy. It's like a cloud of possibilities of which we only live with one. Okay, testing this rigorously is really hard. There's an old study, it's about 2 pages, that basically does study this rigorously with pop songs. And basically it has songs with titles like Trapped in an Orange Peel, that's actually the name of a song, and Gnaw, K-N-A-W, that's also the name of a song. And what the study tries to do is see if people in a control condition hear the songs and download them, you'll get an ordering. How does that compare with subgroups in which people can see how many early downloads Gnaw or Trapped in an Orange Peel is getting? Get the setup? In one, you just listen to the song and download them. Another, you can see whether people in your subgroup, which will consist of thousands of people, are starting to like Trapped in an Orange Peel. You might think, it's tempting to think that in the end, quality will out, that the good songs are going to rise to the top and the bad songs are going to fall. Not so. While the best songs never completely tank and the worst songs never completely go to the top, otherwise anything can happen. Meaning that cultural success and failure, and I hope you're thinking now of presidential candidates and presidents, is often a product of whether there is the equivalent of early downloads that can drive success. Anne Friedman, a writer on Star Wars, puts the point vividly. I realized I was going to see The Force Awakens because all my friends were going to see it and everyone else's friends were going to see it too. I was in the grip of an increasingly rare phenomenon, a true mass cultural event. The idea here is there are 3 mechanisms that explain Rodriguez in South Africa or Jane Austen in the English-speaking world. And they are, first, we take signals from the statements and actions of others. They can drive us strongly in a particular direction. We want to have good reputations among people we care about, so we often act in accordance with their statements and actions. And there are network of benefits to be being part of a group of people who have common experiences. We can think of these as solidarity goods. These can be used strategically to drive success or failure. In China, the government seems implicitly alert to this, at least until relatively recently. I don't have data in the last 2 years, but until relatively recently, in China, if you went online on their equivalent of social media and said, we have very grave concerns about what's happening in the government these days, that's not censored. A lot of dissent is authorized. But if someone posts online, we're having a meeting and it's going to be really big on Thursday on a specific street in Beijing, that's shut down. That's because the Chinese government doesn't want something like a protest activity to become like Rodriguez in South Africa or like Star Wars in the world. If this seems like an unlikely explanation of the success of Star Wars or just a very localized phenomena about particular movies and writers and poets, here's something really recent that generalizes the music experiment to political beliefs. And it's a crazy finding. It involves a bunch of issues where people are told, there's a question about nanotechnology, or whether you like nanotechnology, or there's a question whether you like something like an increase in the minimum wage. And in the experiment, which involved almost 5,000 people, people are given information about whether Republicans or Democrats are liking the relevant thing in their world. Got it? And this is not an artificial thing done by the experimenter. It's that you go into a world and you just happen to learn that Republicans are nervous about nanotechnology because the first people who state their views in that world are Republicans and they don't like nanotechnology. Or you might be in a world where the Democrats aren't liking nanotechnology. Or it could involve immigration. And the first Republicans or Democrats there have a defined view. Okay, here's the stunning fact that this experiment recreates the Music Lab experiment, not for the popularity of songs, but for views on different political issues, and Democrats and Republicans can go any number of different directions depending on what early Democrats and early Republicans say. If you wonder why Democrats and Republicans now think with great conviction certain things they didn't think 15 years ago, this helps explain. There are early downloads now that are driving the behavior. Okay, the craziest finding is that emergent positions adopted by Republicans and opposed by Democrats in one experimental world had the opposite outcome in other parallel worlds. So this is playing kind of the parallel world game, not in a science fiction story about what would have happened if Hitler had decided to continue to be an artist, but in a world in which people are hearing early downloads, Republicans think this, Democrats think that, and whether they hear Republicans think that or Democrats think that depends on serendipity, which is whether the early Republicans or the early Democrats visibly thought this or thought that. And that's very much like the success of Trapped in an Orange Peel, or Not, or Nah. Okay, so the story for Star Wars is not that it isn't spectacular, it is, but that it was the Rodriguez in South Africa. It happened to be the beneficiary of extremely visible early downloads that eventually could create an international phenomenon. I think skeptics would say at this point, seriously, we are attributing the success of this iconic franchise to early downloads? Is that the basic account? It can't be sufficient. So let's look at others. Okay, a second account says what makes Star Wars amazing is its multiple meanings. And here the idea, which is true, is that George Lucas took a story of the hero's journey, which he got from a book with a title very much like that, which says many cultures have a tale of a hero who resists temptation, gives into it, is threatened by evil, leaves home, fights evil, succeeds, and returns home. There's something like those stages. The idea is many religions and myths have something like that story. And the idea is that what Lucas did, partly self-consciously, partly because of a genius imagination, was to enfold many possible understandings onto that single account. One, which I think is true, is that this tale of Star Wars is essentially a Christian tale about redemption. And we'll have more to say about that, but that it layers that onto the hero's journey. You could see it as a deeply feminist story, more conspicuously now than in the early movies, but don't forget that Leia, who is scantily clad in the third movie, ends up slaying the guy who entraps her by the very chains with which she was entrapped. And that shows for its time particularly, a hashtag #MeToo movement, literally with a vengeance. You could see this as a Jeffersonian story where the success of the Jedi Knight rebelling against authority has a democratic small d feel to it. And that certainly helps explain, that is the rebel heart of Star Wars, helps explain its democratic resonance when it came out and to this very day, and its international appeal. It's also a story about technology and depersonalization, in that way very much ahead of its time, with Darth Vader, the evil figure, being dehumanized as a result of his mechanical quality. And that certainly connects with anxieties then and now. Okay, does this have explanatory power, this kind of many mysteries account? Definitely, but in terms of explaining success and failure, there are two things, one of which took me many years to get through my head, the other of which is pretty simple. The simple one is that the many meanings might be a necessary condition for Star Wars success. It may be that its enduring appeal, including the new movies, has to do with the multiple layers and potential arguments about what they're really about. But there are lots of movies with many meanings and layers on the hero's journey, which are like Rodriguez in the United States and the United Kingdom, meaning they didn't break out. There are lots like that. So it's not sufficient. There's an old TV show, maybe 10 years ago, maybe less, called Awake. You can see it on Netflix. And whoa, is it full of many meanings. It's even about parallel worlds. And how many of you have heard of Awake? Okay, more than I expected, 2. That suggests that the view that this is sufficient for success is not adequate. Okay, the thing that took me a while to get out of my head, I have to tell you a Harvard Law School story. I was a brilliant student who came in my office a few years ago and said, I'm interested in success. She wasn't interested, to my knowledge, in Star Wars. She was interested in success. And she said, what I want to do is talk to like 150 people from very successful careers, music, sports, physics, business. I want to talk to them and be very rigorous in the questions I ask and find out what are the unifying characteristics of the 150. And this is a brilliant student. And a light bulb went off on my head saying, this isn't going to work. Not because of anything in her plan that wouldn't work, but that the project was fundamentally misconceived. So I called some social scientist friends up and I said, I have this rough intuition that I can't figure out that it's not going to work. And is that right? And 3 of them gave the same answer. She's sampling on the dependent variable. It's not going to work. The idea there was there may be some characteristics like 5 that all of those people have, but they may not be causally responsible for the success of the 150. It might be there are 350,000 other people who also have those 5 characteristics who never made it. So if you isolate the thing that unifies the 150, you don't have evidence of causation. It might be that all of the 150 had sadness in their childhood. Okay, but there are a lot of people who had sadness in their childhood who didn't make it anywhere. It might be that all 150 had some sort of illness in 5th grade. That's a little more interesting. But is that causally responsible? No. The many meanings explanation is sampling on the dependent variable. It's isolating a characteristic and attributing success to it, but there are lots of other things that I haven't tested that probably have the same characteristic. A third explanation, more tempting, is that after the assassinations of the 2 Kennedys, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and the tumult of the Vietnam era, and Jimmy Carter speaking of the national malaise, the country kind of needed a lift. And a movie whose heart spoke its subsequent title, A New Hope, and a tale of the success of a gee-whiz kid defeating the evil empire, that's what the country and to some extent the world needed, and that's what explains the success. And now, to the extent that Star Wars has been a breakout success again, it's partly because of nostalgia and partly because of the very challenging time in which we're now living, when something like this light break from what seems to many to be occasional darkness is really welcome. The problem with this explanation is it's always possible to generate an ex post zeitgeist explanation. You can always say, with respect to Harry Potter or Taylor Swift or Drake or Parasite, current successful movie, that there's something consistent with where we are now that's explanatory of its success. But whether it's true can't be known by virtue of its announcement. It also has the sampling on the dependent variable problem. There are a lot of cultural failures that connected with the zeitgeist but didn't make it. They're Rodriguez in the United States. Okay, here I confess is what is in a way my personal favorite of the explanations. That is the one I'm most drawn to emotionally. So remember William Blake wrote, the reason Milton wrote in Fetters, there's no reason you should know this quotation, but remember William Blake, the serendipitous, iconic English writer. The reason he wrote, the reason Milton, now Blake, mind you, is speaking of the greatest religious poem, I think, in the English language, Paradise Lost, which is a deeply felt poem about God. Blake writes, the reason Milton wrote in Fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and Liberty when of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet, and that of the devil's party without knowing it. Whoa, yes? Coming from Blake speaking of Paradise Lost. And Blake wrote, those who restrain their desires do so because theirs is weak enough to be restrained. And Blake wrote, better to infant a murder in its cradle than to, I won't have this exactly right, than to hold unacted desires. Now, Blake was not pro-murder, okay? He wasn't advocating this. He was writing Proverbs of Hell, and in the second 2 quotations was trying to capture something that's in the human heart. The first about Milton, Blake was sincere. Tongue-in-cheek, but kind of sincere. The notion here is that Star Wars, certainly in Lucas's version, less so in the recent, which is why they don't make it in the top few, are on to Blake's point. Lydia Millett writes that Vader is the most erotic figure in the Star Wars family and the only tragic one. And because of this, he had a terrible beauty. He has an erotic charge because he gets what he wants. The idea here is what makes Lucas's movies transcendent is that the war in all of us between the dark side and the light side is depicted both in a cartoon and in a way that gets to you. Luke in the Return of the Jedi comes really close to going to the dark side. Rey in the new movies never really does, which makes them short of showing Lucas's, no coincidence, Lucas's alertness to the thin hair that separates all of us at various points in ways that are small or large between the dark side and the light side. Lucas said in an interview at one point, look, every moment of your life, you can be a hero or not. You can be kind to someone, you can take a step in their direction, you can do something to help someone, or not. And this, as he was saying, it wasn't preachy. He was getting at the struggle that, in a more operatic way, Star Wars depicts. Okay, there's a lot of truth, I suggest, in that. But remember the pedantic words about sampling on the dependent variable? There are lots of movies that play well with the struggle between good and evil, the internal struggle between good and evil. That's what makes Star Wars bigger than it seems. It's not just the external struggle, it's the internal struggle. There are lots of things, movies that do that well, but they don't break out. So that can't be it. Okay, the brilliance of the Lucas movies, which Abrams gets toward with the two that he did of the recent movies, is about fathers and sons and redemption. Okay, Anakin, Darth Vader, saves his son. He does that in a way that plays very closely, if you're all over the Star Wars plots, with what makes him go dark when he does. What makes him go dark when he does is his inability to detach himself from human connection. So the way the Emperor gets him to go dark is to talk about his mother and his beloved. And he can save his beloved and possibly save his mother even, who's died. His inability, Anakin's, to detach from loss, which Yoda is begging him to do, is what gets him to go dark, and there's a profound point there. But it's also what redeems his soul. In the end, he saves his father as his son saves him because he can't bear to lose his son. That's to suggest that the connection between parent and child here runs so deep that the child will insist on believing there's good in his father, even when his father is the worst person in the universe. And the father will vindicate his faith by saving him at a moment when vindicating his faith means that Vader basically abandons the cause of his entire life. So Return Without a Jedi has as its immortal moment a statement by Luke, I have to save you, Father, as Anakin, now given his real name finally in the script for the first time. It was always Darth Vader. Now the script says Anakin. Luke says, I have to save you, Father. And Anakin responds, you already have. That's a tale of redemption. Okay. The last explanation says that these are films about agency and freedom. In this way, they are deeply American versions of the hero's journey. Lucas, in an interview at one point, said they're in the same situation. Anakin says yes to the dark side. Luke says no. Why is that? Is it because Anakin has been more damaged? Is it because he's experienced a more searing loss of his mother and beloved? In any case, freedom of choice and agency are all over the movies. At every key moment, there is an insistence that you have agency and it's up to you what to do. That resonates. Emperor Palpatine, the Sith Lord, thinks, and he thinks up until the Rise of Skywalker, that life's trajectory is foreordained. That's why I say Abrams is all over Lucas's imagination. Everything is happening as I have foreseen. Yoda thinks differently. Always in motion is the future. This is a tribute to the power of individual agency. And Vader's dying words, tell your sister you were right. Tell her you were right about me. Abrams gets at that in The Rise of Skywalker. And in the end, Kylo Ren's rejection of the dark side replicates his grandfather's and vindicates Lucas's insistence, which Kasdan, Lucas's adversary, got at really recently when asked about film in a conversation of Star Wars. He says, in something that has to do with freedom and law and politics and individual life, it's the biggest adventure you can have, making up your life. And it's true for everybody. It's infinite possibility. It's like, I don't know what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes, but I feel I can get through it. It's an assertion of a life force. Okay, so Star Wars is primal and a fairy tale, but it's no mere retelling of the story of the hero's journey. It's tons more superficial, and it's even deeper. I've read Campbell. Lucas digs deeper. What its real topic is the decision you make on the spot. It focuses on what it sees as the essential feature of the human condition, freedom of choice amid a clouded future. It pays tribute to the importance of detachment and distance, but its rebel heart embraces intense attachment to particular people, even in the face of lightning bolts from the emperor. Children once grown announce their choice. I am a Jedi like my father before me. In the context, it's moving if you think of what happened to Anakin. Jedi, fallen, most of his life as Sith. Those are Luke's words. So, Star Wars, sure it resonated with the time. Sure it benefited from cascade and network effects. If we're really fussy, we have to put that bullet in large font, but it was bound to succeed. It's just too good. I like that, and I believe it. So as I was looking at you and saying this, I should say something surprising to me happened, which is that the connection between the parallel world serendipity theme in the arc of American history and the success of culture, and something exhilarating about the openness of possibility I saw, which I hadn't seen before. So you could just see it as a descriptive point about what an individual life is or what a nation's course is. But to see this also as not really or gosh, but instead a hopeful thing about individual agency. That, I think, is what Lucas is all over and Abrams got at in the underrated, magnificent Rise of Skywalker.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. I'm just wondering if the consequences of the cascade effect would mean that there's really no intrinsic value in the policies that some people agree with, which includes us. Is that something that you would argue, or no, there's something intrinsic, good and bad?
Okay, so let's take the weak version of the argument, meaning the more modest version, is that things have to be really good to succeed. Now, good might mean, artistically excellent, or the song sounds good, or the idea is good. So that's a necessary condition. But among the universe of things that have necessary conditions, many of them will never see the light, that fulfill that condition, many of them will never see the light of day. So one idea might be there are approximately a zillion actors and singers and politicians whom we will never hear of, who could have, with a little something, become iconic. Now, it might not be a zillion, it might be a quarter of a zillion, but a lot. And the fact that, President Obama became President Obama, President Trump, they both have skills. They're immensely talented in different ways. But is there something deep that made them be president at their time? The idea is no. A few things happened that, okay. The stronger version would be there are a lot of things that do very well in various domains that can't claim goodness. So you haven't heard probably of the music group The Monkees. They can't claim goodness, though they were really big for a time. They did great. And the idea is some things might be vaulted high up that are merely okay. Now, they can't be lousy. So remember in the music lab experiment, you're asking a phenomenal question, and I have to think deeply better than I have about politics. In culture, if you have a song that's just a lousy song, even if it's marketed really well and savvily with, maybe a credible sense, a lot of people are loving this song. If it sounds terrible, it's not going to do well. So that suggests the more modest version is probably right. But the number of ideas, Professor Lessig has many ideas of various different levels of ambition. And among academics, he has more ambitious ideas than I think anyone I know, like a lot of them. And some of them could work out or not. Some of them seem to be working out. They've got traction. And they're good ideas, maybe great ideas. Whether they go or not, the thesis is, depends on some little things that, could propel or not. And I think that's what nations and cultures are like. Maybe want to say I tentatively think that. And it's certainly what individual lives are like. If we think why we are where we are in life, what city we're in, or what we're studying, or whom we're dating, or who our friends are. A lot has to do with little things that are coincidence. We could be, and maybe, I hope you aren't, Rodriguez in the United States. Not that great. Or we could be, if we're at Harvard, we to that extent, I guess, are, Rodriguez in South Africa. How'd that happen? I won't out the politician here, but there's a famous politician who said to me privately, this is a politician on the relative left, that CEOs think I hate them. I don't. It's not at all. I don't have any hate for CEOs. But what they don't seem to know is the fact that their CEOs came from a lot of coincidence and luck. That there, but for the grace of God, they go elsewhere. And this politician said, I know this about myself. I'm doing really well. It could be easily that I wouldn't have made it at all. And so the claim was in individual life, success and failure often has this characteristic. For cultures, it's harder to make that argument. It's more speculative.
Hey, thank you. I'm surprised you didn't hit the theme of insurrectionalism, because that seems very strong in all trilogies. In each one, there is an unstoppable force, power that is defeated by an insurrectionalist band, and they kind of mirror the decades. That to me feels like an important theme that resonates in all those movies.
No, you're completely right. So I think you're being more specific than I was about the Jeffersonian theme. And clearly that helps Star Wars attach itself to certain people. But there are a lot of movies, so I agree that that's a source of its appeal. And it has a kind of joyful, even effervescent insurrectionism. Lucas, in one of his interviews, said, you know, when I watch the movies, I see a kind of giddy effervescence. He said, that's strange because I'm not at all like that as a person. But to combine giddy effervescence with insurrection, that's a really neat trick. And that is, you know, going to increase if it's fun and, you know, skillful and visually arresting, the chance that it was working is high. All I'd add is if we took the universe of insurrectionist movies, even at the time, there'd be a large number, and only one was Star Wars. And why was that? The kind of the less happy-making explanation is it got lucky. The better explanation in terms of what I like and believe is that it was by far the best, connecting with the previous point.
Thank you. I'm wondering, so a lot of the things has been on luck and serendipity, but also that early adoption has a really powerful role. So if we know that about early adoption, can't we manufacture triumph?
Yes.
Or can we, is there something when you force early adoption that the magic doesn't happen in the way that it happens if it unfolds in an unforced way?
Absolutely. And I'm struck by the extent to which the understanding of this isn't as widespread as it should be. But in the Obama campaign in 2008, our line was, we're running to be president of Iowa. We want to be president of Iowa. In the national polls, we were getting killed by Senator Clinton, you know, 30 points behind, 40% behind, and the people on the campaign put in all our minds, don't pay attention to the president of Iowa, meaning win the Iowa caucuses, because that would change everything. Don't focus on the Iowa caucuses will create Rodriguez in the United States with a certain probability, and it completely worked. And, you know, much too early to know what's going to happen in the Democratic primary, but I think Buttigieg particularly, others who didn't do as well, were alert to exactly your point. Manufacture early downloaders. And Senator Sanders, focusing on Iowa and New Hampshire, has also been alert to that. So there, publishers and other purveyors of cultural items know the first week is crucial. If you can get a book out in the first week, hilariously, I found this with the first edition of the book we're talking about now, where I had a very active editor, amazing editor, who thought you have to sell like crazy in the first week. You're doing nothing. Cancel your classes, cancel your life. You do not have children this week. All that matters, you're going to be president of this week. And the thought was that was essential. So with respect to many things, there's an intuitive awareness of this, probably in politics less keen. And after the fact, we often think the person was bound to succeed, or there was something that was connecting uniquely about this person or this product. It's not so. They knew your point. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, Professor. I'm from the Divinity School. Joseph Campbell was close to the Vedanta Society in New York. And there are a lot of these Hindu Vedantic ideas, like many other religious themes in Star Wars. Do you think that accounts for this idea that there is an immanent force, the Force, which unites all of us, and it gives an infinite dimension to others, to us who are otherwise mere mortal creatures? This kind of a suggestion at the, do you think it accounts for kind of the popularity?
Completely. It's a great point. And my list doesn't adequately get hold of that. So here's my little list, and it should have yours on it. That there are multiple religions that are playing in and out, and Lucas was completely aware of that. And Hindu themes are definitely there. The idea of a unifying force to it, the Force, that connects with the human spirit. So people of multiple religions hear that, and something in them is touched completely. That is part of its appeal. And what's I confess that before I wrote the book, I liked Star Wars, but I love it now. And to be able to do that, what you've said, with also the Christian theme of redemption, by which if you turn good at a key moment, it doesn't matter. Or if your child loves you, it doesn't matter. Or your child will love you, so it doesn't matter. That, the redemption theme and the unifying theme of the Force, to put those in the same story, which has spaceships. How do you do that? I think we have to let you go. The Force says that, and there will be books signed.